Welcome to the Toastmasters Podcast, the official podcast of Toastmasters International. Hello, everybody. This is Greg Gazin. If I ask you in what ways can you improve your social skills, meet more people, and attract opportunities, I'm sure having 500 lunches with strangers is likely not one of them. Unless, of course, you are our guest today, who has amazingly surpassed that mark with no end in sight. Some of you may recognize his name. He's Nick Bendel, the owner of Hunter and Scribe, a copywriting agency that creates content for property and finance businesses. Nick is also a Toastmaster, having been a member since 2016, a member of Dynamic North Shore Toastmasters Club. When Nick isn't growing his business or doing public speaking, he's meeting new people. His lunch tally at the time of recording is 516. Nick is profiled in the January 2026 magazine in the article 500 More Lunches. After 500 Lunches with Strangers, this Toastmaster is hungry to continue by Laura Mishkind. And it's a follow-up to the April 2024 article, 500 Lunches with Strangers. And Nick is back again after achieving his big, audacious goal. Coming to us today from down under, Sydney, Australia, where he lives, works, and of course eats, Nick Bendel, welcome back to the Toastmasters Podcast.
Thank you so much, Greg. That was a lovely introduction, and it's so nice to be chatting with you again.
Oh, it is. It's great to have you back. I have been following your journey, not stalking, just following your journey. We spoke back in late March of 2024, not quite 2 years ago. And at that time, you were, I believe, 75% there. I think we were at number 376. How does it feel to have finally reached your goal?
It did feel very satisfying. I was originally planning to have these 500 lunches in 5 years. It ended up taking 6 years. So by the time I finished, it did feel very satisfying, but it was more the destination rather than the goal, which is why, having made it to 500, I'm continuing to have lunches with strangers, and it's something I'm going to do for the rest of my life because it gives me the opportunity to meet so many amazing people, and I've made a lot of friends. I've learned so much about myself and about human behavior and people in general, built an amazing network. My social skills have improved, which I'm really happy about. And given that this has brought so much pleasure to my life, why stop?
I am going to get you to elaborate a little bit on that a little later. I was actually curious what it was like when you were at the home stretch, because typically 500 of anything, by the time you're getting there, you're going, oh, I just want to get there. But obviously it's been exciting, and it seems like it's far exceeded the original reason that you started this particular project. Now, we covered your entire origins in your quest for the memorable lessons and unexpected moments in episode 250, and we'll certainly put a link to that in the show notes. But perhaps for the benefit of our listeners, or just to refresh our audience, can you give us the short version of why you did this to begin with?
Yeah, I'll give maybe a 60-second answer. Back in 2018, I'd started a business, a copywriting agency, as a side hustle. I had a full-time job. And every day when I was showing up to work, I was thinking, oh, well, what can I do to make this business succeed? I'd never had a business before, and I was obsessed with making it succeed because I saw the business as my future. And over the course of a few months, some thoughts started taking shape in my mind, one of them being, if I remain as the person that I am, I'm going to struggle to build a business, because I have always described myself as an antisocial introvert. I like to be at home on my own with a cup of tea and a good book. And I thought that sort of person would struggle to meet potential clients and to build relationships with these people and to make sales. I thought I needed to improve my social skills and strengthen my mindset and put myself out there and be more vulnerable and build a great network. And I thought if I become that person will be able to build a successful business. I didn't have any intention of trying to have lunch with potential clients or trying to turn the people I had lunch with into clients. I thought, just if I become a better person with better social skills, who's more open, more emotionally open, that sort of person will be able to succeed with business. So that was the motivation.
That's awesome. And of course, you met some incredible people along the way. I remember in our previous conversation, you talked about speaking with a hostage negotiator. That was incredible. That was amazing. Could you perhaps share with us, out of the last 100, what were some of the most memorable ones, how they came about, and what did you take away from them?
One of them was really interesting. I had lunch with this woman, and she started telling me about someone she knows through work who was quite a senior politician with the federal government in Australia. And then she just said matter of factly, "Oh, you should have lunch with him." I kind of laughed and I said, "Well, sure, I'd like to have lunch with him, but he also gets a say in the matter. I can't just point to someone and say, 'You must now have lunch with me.'" But I said to her, "Look, when I get back to my computer, I'll find his email address and I'll send him an email," which I did. And to my surprise, he agreed to have lunch with me. I was surprised because I am not part of his electorate, so that I'm not one of his constituents, so he can't gain my vote. And there was nothing I could do for him or offer him. He would have been an incredibly busy man with far more important people wanting to meet him. He agreed to meet me. We had a really, really good chat. He was a nice guy, very interesting lunch. So that's very memorable. Another memorable lunch that comes to mind is someone who is trying to solve homelessness in Australia, and he is looking for a way to come up with some interesting forms of housing in order to make that happen. That was a really, really interesting person to meet. Another person I had lunch with, someone who had been a very senior policeman in New South Wales, the state in which I live. He was kind of ranked the number 2 policeman, and it was fascinating to hear his stories about being on the force for years and the sort of incidents he dealt with and what it was like managing thousands of people and why he ended up leaving the force and the life that he'd built afterwards. That was really, really interesting.
I'm curious about the politician. What did you talk about?
There are all sorts of questions I would love to ask, like what's the Prime Minister really like? Or, what do you really think about this policy? But of course, he could never answer questions like that. He would just have to give you the standard answer. So I deliberately avoided talking about things where I didn't think he could be frank, made sure that the conversation was in areas where he felt safe to talk. So it was more about what he was doing before politics, why he got into politics, what he does outside politics. I discovered that he is a very keen endurance runner. I think I met him in early December 2024, and he mentioned that for New Year's he was planning to do a 50 or 60 kilometer run. Not exactly my idea of fun, but he often goes for very long runs before showing up to Parliament each day. And that's really, really interesting. And also just hearing about how he goes about his job, because he is an introvert. He called himself an introvert in an extrovert's job. And I could kind of relate to that. And just hearing his stories about how he's had to learn to be better with people and how he manages dealing with such a wide diversity of personality and people that he meets, that was really interesting and educational as well.
I know you meet a lot, or you get a lot of your lunch invitations, or you arrange them through LinkedIn. And what you're sharing about sort of a personal story about the runner, that's something that you don't normally get in a LinkedIn profile. In fact, I
Mm.
believe you made a reference in, I think it was in the first article in 2024 about how LinkedIn is very superficial. You don't necessarily get to know the people as you would get to know them when you're having lunch with them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The vast majority of people, me included, in our LinkedIn profiles, we're just putting a few key details, and those details are generally aimed either at potential employers or, if you have a business like me, at potential clients. And we're not going into things about our personal lives because they're not really relevant. So when you sit down to have lunch with a person, you do have a superficial understanding of them. Oh, okay, I'm meeting this guy, Greg, and Greg has got this business or he does that job. But once we start talking, I discover so many things about your life that I had no idea about. And the other person discovers stuff about me too. And that's what tends to make these lunch conversations so interesting and exciting.
You get to learn new things about
Mm.
people and new things that you never learnt about. Maybe you learned something new about running, but also at the same token, you could probably find some commonalities, things that you have in common, like Toastmasters.
Yeah, well, funny you should mention that, because sometimes I'll speak to someone and we'll discover during the meeting that we're both in Toastmasters and neither of us had any idea. And that's always a really nice surprise when that crops up.
Yeah, especially if it's not in their LinkedIn profile, which it should be.
It should be indeed. Mine, I do mention Toastmasters in my LinkedIn profile. So sometimes people will see that before the lunch. I'll say, "Oh, Nick, I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, not stalking Nick. And I noticed that you're in Toastmasters. I've also been in Toastmasters for X number of years."
Yeah, it's funny. I guess in this type of conversation, you have to make sure that you let people know you're not stalking them.
And of course, someone who is a stalker would admit to it. So if you say, I'm not stalking, that is a very reliable statement.
I see. Now, in the past, I recall that you made reference to an elusive interview. You wanted to interview a diplomat. Were you ever able to find one to speak with?
I did find a diplomat to speak with. In fact, I ended up meeting two separate diplomats. One of them was a Dutch diplomat who was based in Australia, and another one was an Australian who'd been overseas for many years. And I met her, I think, just a few months before retirement, funnily enough. I'm very interested in foreign affairs and the world and politics and different cultures and history. Being able to discuss those things with those two diplomats was fascinating, and getting insights into what it's like to be a diplomat and the conversations that you have and the specific places they work. That was absolutely fascinating.
Did you tell them both that this was on your bucket list, your dream come true?
I did mention that to both of them. Both of them were a little bit flattered. It's funny. I remember the second diplomat I'd met. There's a place in Australia called the Gold Coast where people often go on holiday. She had never been to the Gold Coast, but she did mention that she had been to Khartoum in Sudan. I remember thinking, that's very interesting. That's the sort of life you've lived. That you have lived in Sudan, but you've never been to the Gold Coast in Australia, which almost everyone in Australia has been to.
I noticed in the current article, you make reference to the next elusive interview.
Was that with Esther Perel?
Yes, it was.
It's funny because after that interview came out, someone contacted me over LinkedIn, funnily enough, and said, "Oh, Nick, I find your lunch is really interesting. Hello to Afton, by the way, if you're listening to this." And I was thinking of doing the same thing. Can we have a Zoom meeting? So we had a really, really nice chat. And then she said, "Oh, what's happening with Esther Perel?" And I'd completely forgotten that I'd said that. And I said to her, "Well, okay, thank you for reminding me. I should probably maybe take action." So I promised her after our chat that I would find Esther Perel's email address and send her an email. So I did. It doesn't go directly to her; it goes to her people. I got an automated email saying something like, "We receive so many inquiries from all around the world, and if Esther is interested in speaking to you, we'll get back to you within a week." And suffice to say, I have not received a message from Esther or her people since. I don't hold it against them. She is very, very busy and could meet far more interesting people than me. So, for the foreseeable future, I will not be meeting Esther Perel, but I'm not ruling out the two of us having lunch at some point in the unforeseeable future.
Maybe perhaps on the podcast, you can share a little bit about who she is and why, and maybe someone listening might just put a bug in her ear.
Well, I do like that, Greg. Esther Perel is a world famous psychologist, particularly when it comes to couples and romantic relationships. And I always found psychology fascinating. And I think I first learned about her perhaps 25 years ago. I read a magazine feature about her and never heard of her at the time, and she sounded interesting, and I've just followed her ever since. And every time I listen to one of her speeches or one of her interviews or a podcast with her, she has so much wisdom about human relationships, not just romantic, but platonic as well. And I learned so much from listening to her, and she is so fascinating. And I just think if I had the privilege of being able to spend an hour or two with her, it would just be one of the highlights of my life. So, Esther, if you are listening to this, let's make it happen.
I wasn't aware of who she is, but because I read the article and I saw her name mentioned, I did look her up a little bit, and certainly someone to follow up. I'd like to learn a little bit more about what she does as well.
Well, would you like me to invite you along to the lunch that I'm having with her?
Might be a little far to go. Where does she live?
Well, she's Belgian, so I think she's often in Europe, but I think she's often in America as well. I did say in my email that I would fly to wherever she wanted to meet. I can't say, Greg. We might be having lunch, the three of us in Belgium.
I think that would be a good thing.
It would. It would give us an excuse. You could fly from Canada. I could fly from Australia. I suppose she would have maybe a 5-minute drive to her local cafe, but we'd all have a great lunch.
So, Nick, we spoke about some of your interviews, the people. Let's talk a little bit about you and the conversations. In Toastmasters, one of the foundational philosophies, something that was drilled into me years ago when I first joined, was that in Toastmasters, we learn by doing.
Hmm.
And 500 Lunches, of course, is certainly doing. Thinking about maybe the last year or two, what are some of the things, I know you touched upon them, but what are some of the things that perhaps you've learned about yourself or others having these experiences?
This is maybe going to sound a bit gloomy. It's not meant to be gloomy, but I've really learned how insecure all of us are. All of us are riddled with insecurities. It doesn't matter what our age, background, profession, status, wealth level is. We all have insecurities, which sounds gloomy, but actually, it's very enlightening and it can actually help you achieve more in life. The reason being because we're all hyper aware of our insecurities and because we focus so much on ourselves, we often don't realize that other people are dealing with the same stuff. And we think because we're thinking about ourselves all the time that everyone else is thinking about us, but they're not. They're thinking about themselves and their own insecurities. Once you know that, it doesn't make your own insecurities disappear, but it does allow you to make a conscious decision to maybe ignore your insecurity and do a particular thing that scares you anyway. Once you realize, hey, people probably aren't looking at me, they're probably not waiting to laugh at me and judge me. They probably don't even care. They probably won't even notice. And anyway, they've got their own stuff to worry about. And to the extent that they are noticing, they'll probably admire me for doing this thing, knowing how uncomfortable or scary it is. That makes it easier to do that thing. And what we often say is, I'll do that thing once I get the confidence, but it's actually the other way around. It's doing scary things that gives you the confidence. So once you realize that we're all dealing with insecurities, it makes it easier to do uncomfortable things, which then gives you more confidence, which then allows you to do more things. Once I learned this lesson, it's actually allowed me to do more and achieve more in life.
So, Nick, with becoming a little more comfortable in what you're doing, of course, 500 plus lunches, I'm curious, how have your conversations changed from perhaps many of the earlier ones?
I think at the start, I was often trying to impress people in some way, especially if I met someone who I thought was maybe smarter than me or more successful than me, better than me in some way, whether they were or they weren't. If that was the story in my head, for all intents and purposes, they were. And I would often try to impress them. And often the way we try to impress them is maybe we talk too much or we try to big note ourselves or we cut them off and interject and try to say something smart. I've now really gotten over that and I approach conversations differently. I do a lot less talking. I almost never interrupt people. I don't feel the need to big note myself in the way that I did before. I don't feel the need to try to prove myself in the way that I did before. And that allows me to be more open with the conversations, and by letting the other person speak more, it actually makes them feel more comfortable and more valued, and it leads to better conversation. But I have noticed, because we're all riddled with insecurities, Greg, a lot of people I notice behave the way I used to behave in the conversation because they're often nervous when they meet me because this is their first lunch with a stranger. It's not my first lunch, so I'm now familiar with it, but they're often nervous, and you can see them doing those things I mentioned. They'll cut me off. They'll try to say something clever, and I understand why they're doing it. I don't hold it against them, and I think, oh God, I used to be like that. I find that if I give them the opportunity to speak, they tend to become more comfortable, and they really feel like we've got a connection, and they begin opening up. It leads to a much better conversation.
I still get a little imposter syndrome every once in a while, even after having been a podcaster for 20 years.
Well, I remember reading a few years ago that the smarter you are and the more successful you are, the more likely you are to suffer from imposter syndrome.
Is that the, what do they call it? The curse of knowledge?
Quite possibly. Have you heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is kind of the opposite, where
No.
someone knows so little about a particular subject that they think they know a lot and they don't realize how ignorant they are? Whereas if you have a lot of knowledge about a subject, you tend to realize how little about it you know. That's why people who are more intelligent and more successful often have imposter syndrome because they realize, oh my God, I know these 10 things, but there are a million things I don't know. That's why they tend to be more susceptible to it.
Yeah, it's like in Toastmasters. I've been a Toastmaster for almost 24 years, and I'm finding that I'm always learning new things. I've met a
Mm.
number of people who have come to Toastmasters, and after a year or two, they figure, yeah, I'm a speaker. I'm as good as I'm going to get, or I'm great now. I'm just going to move on. And they don't realize how much more that they have to learn. In fact, every time I do an interview, I learn something new.
Mm. I love that. I'm the same when people are new to my Toastmasters club and they'll ask me, "Oh, Nick, how long have you been a member?" And I'll say, 10 years. And they're like, "But why are you still coming? You speak well." And I say, "Well, I'm still learning." They're always surprised to hear that. And then I explain that the steepest learning curve, of course, is at the start. That's when you learn the most. But still learning after 10 years, you're still learning after 25 years. We never stop learning.
You may not learn as much as quickly, but you
Mm.
still do learn, and you may find that one golden nugget and you go, OMG, why didn't I ever think of this before?
Yes, and it's funny how that golden nugget often seems so obvious, and that's what makes it so amazing that it had never been thought of earlier.
It's like the little piece of feedback you get from a speech you might deliver at a club meeting, and it's the feedback is given to you by a guest or a brand new member who sees things with fresh eyes, and then you go, I never realized that before.
Well, maybe the two of us can give some feedback like that to Esther Perel during our lunch.
I guess that's wishful thinking. So these conversations that you have you found that you are asking different types of questions, maybe taking more challenges or taking more risk asking questions that perhaps you didn't have the confidence to ask before?
That's a good question. I didn't fully realize this when I started the lunches, but I was very emotionally closed. Little bit by little bit throughout the lunches, I became more and more open and more willing to discuss personal things about me, which then leads to me being more willing to ask personal questions about the other person. Because in the past, I wouldn't want to ask those personal questions about them in case they then ask the same personal questions about me. So I have noticed that I'm more likely to ask those sorts of personal questions, which wasn't happening before. I've also noticed one of the people I had lunch with, Julie, she gave me some great advice. She says that when she meets a stranger, she pretends that they are the most interesting person in the room. Once you plant that thought in your mind, it changes your body language. It makes your body language really positive towards the other person, and it also means that you're listening really closely and you're just so keen to hear what they say, and you're asking all these great follow-up questions, and that helps you build rapport. And by implementing that advice from Julie, I think that's probably changed some of the questions I ask as well.
Excellent. You mentioned follow-up questions, and it's interesting. I have a note here, and it refers back to that. One of the things that I've discovered is you ask an initial question, and sometimes the more important question can be a follow-up question. And
Mm.
what you're doing, meeting strangers for the first time, I'm often talking to people from obviously the Toastmasters world, talking on the podcast. I've never met them before. What I found is over time, I'm asking better questions. And in fact, I will refer you to Dr. Allison Wood Brooks. I interviewed her in episodes 275 and 276. The episodes were entitled Better Conversations, One Question at a Time. She's a Harvard professor, and she shared about how asking better questions boosts connections. It makes the dialogue better, and it really transforms the conversations. And what I've found is over time, I'm finding that I'm always asking better questions. And in fact, I was initially intimidated in speaking with her because I wasn't sure if I was going to be asking really good questions or not. Turns out I passed.
From the first chat that we had a couple of years ago, I remember thinking you asked really good questions. I think part of it, Greg, is you're asking questions and you're genuinely open to what the other person might say. Sometimes we ask questions to tee the person up to say specific things so we can then talk, or we ask a question and then we try to answer the question for the other person. I think what's important is to just be genuinely open to whatever the other person might say. And I think that leads us naturally to asking better questions.
Yeah, that's true. When we spoke back in 2024, you had indicated that you were inspired by Kaylee Chu
Yes.
and her book on 100 lunches. And of course, folks, you can go back and listen to episode 250 to get the full details. I understand that perhaps you're thinking of doing your own book.
Yes, yes, your sources are correct. I am in the process of writing a book, which I think will be launched in around June or July.
I'm assuming that it's obviously about these lunches. How do you remember? Do you take notes? Do you follow up? How are you going to remember all this stuff?
I have a spreadsheet where I have all my lunches listed. After every lunch, I write a post and I publish the post on LinkedIn with the other person's permission. There are a few people who have said, Nick, I'd prefer if you didn't publish something, which is completely fine. Of, I think, the 500 people I met, I think I had maybe 490 posts written about them. These are short articles of maybe 200 words. So there's always a record I can go back to. And I do like to reread them from time to time. There are things in there that I often forget. Oh, that's what I talked about when I met Greg. Oh, yeah, that's right. That's something that happened to Greg when he was a child that I completely forgotten about. I do have records about the vast majority of my lunches.
And you keep in touch with people. In fact, I read that on every August 27th, you have lunch with Kaylee. You go back and forth between locations.
Yes, because she's in Melbourne, I'm in Sydney. We catch up every year on the anniversary. Last year we were in Melbourne. I think the year before that we were in Melbourne also. I do know and I'm not disclosing anything she hasn't already disclosed. She is pregnant, and I think from doing my maths, she'll be close to giving birth around our anniversary on August 27th. So I think she'll probably have more important things to do for this year's anniversary. So I don't know if she'll be open to meeting, maybe a quick Zoom chat. But also, all the other people I meet, I organise a coffee every 3 months and I invite every single person who lives in Sydney to this coffee. And I always say, we're meeting on this date at this place at this time. You don't need to RSVP. No pressure to attend. If you want to show up, just show up. If you don't, that's completely fine. So I never know how many people are going to show up or who's going to show up. Whenever these coffees happen, because I've met so many different types of people, all different ages, backgrounds, professions, the group, whoever it is, it's always really diverse and they love meeting each other. The most recent coffee was 10 days ago, and something really interesting happened, Greg. The group kind of split into two conversations. I was in one conversation, and the other conversation was three women who didn't know each other before this coffee, and coincidentally, they were all single. After chatting for about 10 minutes, they kind of came to me and they said, Nick, we have an idea that we've come up with, and we want you to implement the idea. And I said, oh, what is it? And they said, well, Nick, we discovered that we're all single and we're finding it really hard to meet people online because you look at all these profiles and you don't know if they're real people or if they're writing real things about themselves. Then you meet the person, they turn out to be different than what you expected and disappointing, and you don't really know. It's so hard to trust people with online dating. And then they said, but Nick, we've met you and we know you and we like you. And so, of course, we trust you. And we know you've met these 500 people who you have personally vetted. And there are some of us here today, and we know that they're all really great people. So, Nick, you should organize an event where you invite all the single men and all the single women you've had lunch with and bring them together. And I said, that is a really great idea. However, you should organize it. And then once you've organized it, I'll email all the people in my lunches network and let them know. So they were very excited and they have started work on it. They're looking for venues. I'm really, really curious to see how this turns out. And hopefully we might have a few of these people get together and maybe one day even get married.
Wow. You can have lunch with a married couple. That would be awesome.
That would be nice. It would be so nice if, because I've met so many amazing people. And part of the reason I started having these coffees every 3 months, when I'd have lunch with people, they'd say, oh, Nick, who have you met? And I'd say, I've met this guy, Greg, or I've met this other person, this other person. And they're like, wow, Greg sounds amazing. I'd love to meet Greg. So I thought, oh, I feel a bit greedy keeping all of you wonderful people to myself. So why don't I organize a coffee every 3 months where all of you can meet each other? And so I have a feeling that there could be some amazing couples that could get formed if only these people could meet at a singles night.
Nick Bendel, matchmaker.
Yes, yes. I wasn't expecting to be a matchmaker. By the way, one of the most fascinating lunches I had in my final 100 was with a professional matchmaker.
Nice. So, Nick, let's talk about goals for a moment. When it comes to achieving something big, we often hear the idiom "one bite at a time" when it comes to that. familiar question, which you know, how to eat an elephant. But in your article, you introduce sort of a different framework. You talk about 4 keys to achieving anything. So it seems that rather than focusing on the destination, you break this process down in a very practical way. So could you just perhaps walk us briefly through these 4 keys and why they're important?
I'd love to, Greg. Just before that, I'd make the point that all of us, me included, come up with so many goals in our life, and the vast majority of these goals we either never begin or we never complete the journey. I don't want to give the impression that I'm some sort of goal achieving mastermind and that I'm just achieving goals left, right, and center. I'm as prone to not starting or not completing goals as the next person. But by doing these 500 lunches, I stumbled upon this framework, which I'm going to share with you. It wasn't something I had in mind at the start, but it just was something I came to understand as I went and did these 500 lunches. So, firstly, whatever the goal is, you need to have enough time, money, and bandwidth to complete the goal. And I guess we can refer to time, money, and bandwidth as resources. You might be 100% committed to the goal, but if you just don't have the resources to achieve the goal, you're not going to be able to achieve it. So that's a very practical thing. You need time, money, and bandwidth. The second thing, if it's a big goal, if it's something ambitious, by definition, that means it's something that is uncomfortable and something that is probably going to be new in some way as well. And therefore, if you stay as the exact same person that you are, you're not going to be able to achieve this new thing because our current habits and thoughts are perfectly designed to deliver us our current results. If we want different results, we need to think and act differently. So I would say if we're pursuing a big goal, the second thing we need to do is we need to form new habits, and we probably need to form new relationships as well, because chances are we're not hanging around with the sort of people who are going to help us achieve that goal. It doesn't mean the people we're hanging around with are bad. But if, for example, I decide my goal is to run a marathon, all my friends might be fantastic, but if none of them have run a marathon or if none of them are into running, well, I need to now start hanging around with some people who are into running. The third thing we need to do if we're pursuing a big goal is we need to ignore self-doubt. Again, if it's a big goal, it's going to feel uncomfortable, it's going to feel scary, it's going to push us out of our comfort zone, and we're going to constantly have negative thoughts in our head. We're going to constantly be telling ourselves, can I really do this? Who am I to think I can do this? What gives me the right? And there might even be some people who we know who are telling us, Nick, you're never going to do that. What are you thinking? We need to ignore those internal and maybe external voices as well, because anything that's ambitious by definition is going to involve doubt. The self-doubt isn't a bug, it's a feature of pursuing an ambitious goal. So we need to realize that it comes with the territory. And difficult though it is, we need to ignore those negative voices and push forward regardless. And then the final thing we need to do, the fourth and final thing, if we're pursuing a big goal, we need to make sure that the goal aligns with our values. Because if it is a big goal, it's going to require sacrifices. It's going to require us overcoming the self-doubt. It's going to require us putting up with discomfort. And if the goal doesn't align with our values, then we're not going to be able to push through all of those things. To put it another way, if we really believe in the goal, if it really does align with our values, we are going to be pulled towards that goal. But if it doesn't align with our values, there's always going to be something blocking us. It's almost like we're going to be driving towards the goal with one foot on the accelerator and one foot on the brake. So, just to recap those 4 things you need if you want to pursue a big goal. First, you need to have enough time, money, and bandwidth. Second, you need to form new habits and new relationships. Third, you need to ignore self-doubt. And then the fourth thing, Greg, you need to make sure the goal aligns with your values.
Nick, that's certainly some sage advice. And folks, if you've found this episode enlightening as much as I have, I encourage you to share it with your friends, family, and fellow Toastmasters. You can find the Toastmasters podcast at toastmasterspodcast.com, toastmasters.org, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere you get your podcast. And don't forget to check out Nick's profile in the January 2026 issue of the Toastmaster magazine, entitled 500 More Lunches. After 500 Lunches with Strangers, this Toastmaster is hungry to continue, by Laura Mishkind. And of course, episode 250, 500 Lunches with Strangers, Breaking Bread for Personal Growth. And we'll certainly put links to all those in the show notes, including, Nick, before we wrap up, if you can please remind folks where they can reach out to you to find out more about Hunter and Scribe, to find out more about having lunches with strangers, or perhaps this new matchmaking service that you're putting together.
Yes. If you're single, contact me. Not so I can date you, but I can set you up with someone eligible in your neighborhood. Joking, of course. The best way to find me is over on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. Send me a connection request, and I'd love to connect with you that way.
Nick Bendel, thank you so much for spending the time to speak with me today, and bon appetit.
Thank you, Greg. Great to chat again.